Hi, welcome back. I'm Oliver Lundy, a photographer from the UK, and this video is all about how to shoot in manual. Okay, so this is part of my bigger photography series. There is a playlist, and I'll link it down below, that has all of the videos in order, but in the previous videos we've been looking at each individual element of the exposure triangle, and this video is about how you actually put that into practice when you're out there shooting. So the first part is going to be looking at why you should shoot in manual versus all the other modes, a brief description of those other modes and the odd exception where it's okay to use them or where you should use them. And then we're going to go into the practicals of how you actually choose your settings when you go out into the field. So that's this video. If you already are comfortable shooting in manual, then by all means skip ahead to one of the more kind of advanced videos, whereas if you just can't figure out what settings to use, then this is the right place. So shooting in manual, why do it at all? The cameras are really sophisticated these days. They have automatic modes that will get you most of the way there, or even all the way there in a lot of cases. So why shoot it in manual, and why do most pros shoot in manual? Well, when you let the camera make decisions for you, which is what happens in automatic mode, it will always pick a safe setting. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes just being able to get a shot that's reasonably well exposed, that's in focus, all those elements, is a good thing, and you can just rattle off shots. And if you're not bothered about the artistic creation of it, or if you're not bothered about getting a particular look or feel to the image, then you can definitely use an automatic mode. And for a lot of people, that's all they need. In fact, if there are a lot of people, just using your phone is going to be the right solution. Just take it out, take a snap, and away you go, and that's all you need. If, however, you want to take photography more seriously, if you're looking at making a living from it, or you're looking at using it as a hobby that you want to explore, then shooting in manual is the way to go, partly because it gives you complete control. So you get to pick what the photo looks like because you're picking what the elements that go into it are, and also it means that you learn the principles behind photography and how you get a camera to take an image, and that learning process that forces you to learn, or shooting in manual forces you to learn that process, and therefore you will get a better understanding of how a camera works, and most importantly, what its limitations are. Because if you don't know what its limitations are, and there are various ones in different scenarios, then you won't know when you can't get an image, and you'll just go, oh well, why didn't this work? I had it in auto, it should just work. And whereas if you shoot in manual, you'll know why it doesn't work and how to compensate if possible. So that's why you should shoot in manual. The exceptions are if getting a photo of any type or quality, let's say, is more important than the top quality of that photo. So a particular moment at a wedding, let's say, so the first time that the bride and groom leaves the church or wherever the venue is, can be a big moment because it's often when people throw confetti and so on. It's a great moment to capture. But if you're coming from an inside to an outside environment, the light changes radically very quickly. And so having a camera in one of the automatic modes, let's say shutter priority or aperture priority, then your camera will make the adjustment for you without you having to spend time changing the settings, and therefore you won't miss that moment. Now, most pros that I know would say that they're pretty quick at changing settings, particularly if they know they're about to go from one setting to another, and they know how quickly it takes them to do that. So it's not an issue for most pros who are very experienced, but when you're learning, it can be a nice bit of a safety net, let's say. And there are other scenarios where it might be useful if the weather's constantly changing, or you're shooting an environment where you're having to shoot someone in the shade or something happening in the shade at the same time as someone in direct sunlight, and that can be a challenging environment too. So there are places for these automatic modes, but I would say that the best way is to learn manual, and then you'll be able to make the most out of the automatic settings when you need to use them. So that is why I suggest shooting in manual, and we're going to get cracking with that right now. Okay, very quickly, recapping the exposure triangle. So the three main settings you're going to be using are ISO, aperture and shutter speed. Some combination of those three settings will be how you get an exposure in a camera, and what you adjust depends on where you're starting, but ultimately it's going to be one of those three, and each one of those three can brighten and darken an image. If you haven't already seen them, go and check out my video on each one of these settings, because each one of them not only can brighten and darken an image, but it can also, or does also, affect another part of the image. So it can affect depth of field for aperture, shutter speed affects motion blur, and ISO affects how much grain you're going to see in your final image. So it's worthwhile checking out those if you're not familiar with the individual elements, but assuming that you either are familiar with them or you've already checked out those videos, we're going to now go into where you would actually start, or how I go about picking my settings when I go out on a shoot. So the key thing is you've got to start with something that you want, and it's going to change dependent on the scenario that you're in and what you're shooting. So I'm going to go through a couple of kind of pretty common scenarios to give you an idea. So let's say that you are going out and you're going out to shoot landscape photography. So with landscape photography, normally you can control your own environment pretty well, and therefore you can shoot at the absolute base ISO of 100, or whatever your base ISO is on your camera. It's normally 100, and therefore you know that you're going to try and shoot at ISO 100, but also you know roughly what your aperture is going to be, because you're typically, anyway, in landscape photography, you're going to want the whole of the image front to back in terms of depth. So the closest thing to you and the furthest thing away, you want to be sharp. You want the whole scene to be sharp, and therefore you want the deepest depth of field possible, and you're going to want to use an f-stop of kind of 8 or above. And you know, you could go all the way up to sort of f22 and above, but as we discussed in the aperture video, you get something called diffraction, which essentially softens your image slightly if you go really high on the f-stop to get deeper depths of field. But f8, generally speaking, is a good spot, and kind of f11, f16 will get you almost the entire image in focus anyway, in the majority of situations. So anyway, we're going to go in more into the specifics of individual genre and the kind of the settings and the specific things that you need to know for those later on. But for now, just for this example, you know you're going to be shooting at an aperture of, let's say, f8. And so all you need to do now is work out the other two. So we know that with ISO, you want to shoot at the lowest possible whenever you can. So you're going to be shooting at 100 if you possibly can. And therefore, the only thing that's left is shutter speed. So all you need to do is work out what shutter speed is the right shutter speed to get a correct exposure for that scene that's in front of you. Now that could be very different depending on whether it's the middle of the day or twilight or even at night. So how do you know that you've got the right exposure? Now there is no such thing as a correct exposure. It's whatever you think is correct. You could be going for a very dark and moody scene, or you could be going for a very bright and airy scene. So what is correct is up to you, but how do you know whether it's a correct exposure or not? Now, looking on the back of the camera, so you take a test shot and you guesstimate the settings, you take a test shot and it's wildly wrong, and you just have to look at the back of the screen and go, yeah, it's miles too dark or miles too bright, and you can kind of fine tune it. But how do you actually get it to the point where it's bang on? And there's two ways to tell. In your camera there'll be a light meter. That light meter is normally triggered when you half press the shutter, which if you also have focus set to half pressing the shutter, then it's the same as when you focus. If not, then you're using the back button focus, which is great. But a little light meter will come up, and I'll put a kind of image up on the screen of it. And essentially at one end, or right in the middle, is a bar, and there's a line, and that line moves around depending on how well or not the image is exposed. And it will use an average of the scene in front of you to make that assumption. So it's a pretty basic overview of the image, but it works for the majority of the time. And if it's to the left, my left, so your left, then it's underexposed, and each line on that sort of scale represents a single stop. And if it's to the right, so my left, your right, then it's too bright. and you can essentially change your shutter speed until you get that line right in the middle, and that's what the camera thinks is a perfect exposure for that scene. I won't go into what a camera thinks is a perfect exposure, but generally speaking, it's a good place to start. The other way is to look at the image on the back of the camera and go into your menu and select the option that allows you to see the histogram. It's normally by pressing the info button whilst you're looking at the actual image you've just taken on the back of the camera. And what it will bring up is a histogram, and a histogram is just a graph which represents the level of luminosity across the spectrum of dark to bright or black to white. And I'm going to put one up on the screen right now, and very, very simply, on the left side of the image is the blacks, and then it goes to shadows, then the midtones, then the highlights, then the whites. And if there's any bars or any of the shape that hits the very, very left of the screen, then you have something in your image that's completely black, so no information at all, it's just gone completely dark. And then at the other end, if it hits the right edge, then there's a part of your image that is overexposed, which is it's gone completely to white, so there's no longer any detail in there, it's just white. Now that's not necessarily a problem, and we're going to talk about clipping in a second, but if the majority of the information is in the middle of the histogram, or you've got a nice even spread across the whole histogram and you're not touching either ends, then in theory you have a correctly exposed image, because none of it is so dark that it's gone to black, or so white that it's gone, or so light that it's gone completely to white. Now, it does depend on the scene you're looking at, because if you're shooting a very dark scene with only a small amount of light information in it, then the histogram will look quite weird, and it might still be correct. So, you know, learning histogram is a whole nother thing, and I'm going to do a dedicated video on that. But generally speaking, using either the light meter or the histogram is a good place to start. You can also just use what the image looks like on the back of the screen, but just bear in mind, if you're in a very, very bright environment, your screen isn't going to look particularly bright, so you might accidentally overexpose everything, and vice versa in the dark. If you're out in the dark shooting, the screen's going to look incredibly bright, and when you get all your pictures back on the computer, they're going to look really dark. So, but this is about trial and error, and part of the use of this channel is go out and try things. So, and I'll get to the exercise in a second, but ultimately it's about getting roughly where you need to be, trying it, assessing how well you did, and then doing it again. And when you first start, you're going to be all over the place because you don't necessarily know what to look for and you don't know these pitfalls, and you will make mistakes, and that's totally fine. Underexposing by a couple of stops isn't the end of the world. It can to some degree be fixed in post, and it's part of the learning process, but like I said before, it's really, really worth spending the time to learn manual so that you can learn these principles. So that's where you would start. So for landscape photography, it's you know that the aperture is going to be f8, and you know that your ISO is going to be 100, and then you're just going to change the shutter speed to whatever it needs to be to get a correct exposure. So the opposite of that might be, say, a portrait session where you want a shallow depth of field because you want to isolate your subject from the scene and therefore blur the background out, and so you're going to go with the lowest possible aperture that you can use, and so maybe 1.8, 1.4, something like that, and then you're going to again adjust the shutter speed accordingly to the environment you're in, and quite often that'll be quite a high shutter speed because you're now shooting with a big wide open aperture, so lots of light's coming in. So, and a complete opposite to both of those is where you don't start with aperture at all. You actually start with shutter speed, and that might be when you're shooting something fast-moving like sports or action, or just people in a crowd or something like that, where you want to capture things and freeze them in time, essentially, but you know that you can't shoot below a certain shutter speed in order to do that, so you're going to start with shutter speed, and then you'll use whatever aperture is going to suit that shutter speed, and then if you run out of options, you can then use ISO. And the reason why ISO is almost always last is because you only ever boost your ISO if you've got no other option, because boosting your ISO or raising your ISO will add grain to your images, and ideally we shoot without doing that, so we shoot at 100 ISO if possible. And there is a trade-off, of course, with all of this, and it's because if you use, say, aperture to darken off your image because it's too bright, then you don't necessarily get the shallow depth of field that you want. So the only thing that you can do if you are shooting outside at shallow depths of field, so big wide open aperture, and you're already at 100 ISO, what if it's still too bright? And I actually ran into this in Santorini shooting during the middle of the day. It's very, very bright there, lots and lots of white buildings, and I couldn't shoot at my maximum aperture because my camera at the time only went to 4 thousandths of a second, and that wasn't fast enough. It was still overexposing, and I didn't have an ND filter, which is just a filter you can screw onto the front of your lenses to darken down the image. So I just had to stop down to 1.8 or f2, I think it was. So that's the principle. So you start off with what you need, whether that's shutter speed or aperture, and then you build the rest of the exposure around that based around the scenario. So what are the limitations that you're going to run into that I mentioned earlier about knowing the limitations of your camera? So we already talked in the shutter speed video about handshake and about motion blur. So if you drop your shutter speed too low to brighten the image, then you can run into either handshake, where your hands literally shake the camera slightly or enough to blur the image, or it might be that the thing that you're taking a photograph of is moving too fast to be captured at that shutter speed, and therefore you can only go so low on the shutter speed. Well, other than raising your ISO, the only thing that you can do is add more light. So there's two ways. One is add more light, so either use flash or any kind of artificial light, or if you can, take the whole shoot to an outdoor environment or somewhere that's lighter in order to get more light, or you can raise your ISO. And obviously raising the ISO is the easier of the two if you don't have the flexibility to set up a light and so on. But generally speaking, you're going to get better quality, or almost always you're going to get better quality if you can add more light instead of raising the ISO. So the other thing, there's three things. So raising your ISO, adding more light using artificial light, or using something to stabilize the camera. So if you've got an environment, so if it's not the environment that's moving, the subject of your photo is moving, and that's why you can't go with a low shutter speed. So say a landscape image where the mountain isn't going to move, then you can just put the camera onto a tripod or anything that's stable, assuming that you can get the right frame, and that way you can use a longer shutter speed without having any camera shake. And that's typically why landscape photographers shoot almost everything on a tripod, because it eliminates any kind of shake from their images, and they want the sharpest possible image that they can get. So stabilizing the camera is the next way, or the other way, to use slower shutter speeds, and you'll see it quite a lot with things like if you want to do long exposures at night to get light trails, or darker situations like twilight and sunrise and things like that, you would have to use a kind of longer shutter speed of a couple of seconds at least to get a correct exposure. So you need the camera to be on a tripod, and it's so sensitive, in fact, that what you even need to do is use a timer or a remote release, because just the act of pressing the shutter button can be enough to add some shake. So that's what to do if you get to the lower limits. If you get to the upper limits, then as in the situation is so bright and you can't shade it off in any other way, as in you can't literally decrease the light in the situation, and you don't want to stop down and lower your aperture settings because you want to shoot at maximum aperture, then, like I said before, ND filters are the only way to then darken the image. I've actually got one on this camera right now so that I can affect the brightness and darkness of this image. So I'll just show you. So if I increase the ND filter, which is a variable one, it gets darker, and if I brighten it up, it gets brighter. So you can see that it literally it's like putting sunglasses on your camera, so you can shoot at the upper end. So those are the limitations that you run into with camera shake and focusing that way. The other thing to bear in mind with shooting at maximum apertures or very wide apertures is that you get a very, very shallow depth of field, and sometimes that's great because you get subject isolation in a blurred background, which is great, but sometimes it can be very tricky because you can miss focus completely. So if you've got a really shallow depth of field, you can say focus on someone's eye, but their nose would be completely blurred, or one of their eyes is in focus and the other one isn't because their head's slightly rotated. So it's not always desirable to shoot at a really wide open aperture, so you just need to be careful of that. So the limitations with shooting at wide open apertures is quite often too shallow a depth of field. And then the last limitation is, well, what happens if you're shooting at maximum aperture, you're shooting at as slow a shutter speed as you can go, and you've kind of got as high as you want to go with ISO before you get loads of noise in your images. Well, then you just have to add light, and that's really it. The only other thing that you can do is take the whole scenario to a brighter place, like I said before. So that's how you go about shooting in manual, and the only way that you're going to get familiar with this is by going out and trying it. It's by going out and guesstimating where you think you might need to be, and as you learn more, you'll be able to get closer and closer to the right settings without having to even really think about it. And then if you've not got it right, then you go about changing it, and you make adjustments based around what you're seeing on the back of the camera. Okay, so briefly to recap, start with what you need in the image, so either what aperture you're going to need to shoot at because you want a lot of depth of field or not, and then you make the second adjustment with the other one, so shutter speed. And again, if you're shooting something fast moving, then you're going to need to start with shutter speed and then choose the aperture. And then if you have to, you can raise the ISO, or ideally find some other way to brighten your scene. And that's pretty much it. There are a few other settings that we're going to need to go into before you actually start taking photos, and I'm going to go into that in the next video. But that's the exposure triangle. So the exercise for this is I want you to go out and I want you to shoot lots of different types of scenes in different lighting conditions. So you can shoot indoors or outdoors, or you can shoot during the middle of the day, or you can shoot at twilight or sunrise, or at night even, and see what it takes to actually get a correctly exposed image, and see what happens to it with those settings. And then also keep going until you can't get an image and you actually run into the limits of what your camera can do, and then you know where the limits are, and it'll be a lot easier to work within them. And the more you can do this and the more you can challenge yourself, the easier you will find the settings part of photography. And trust me when I tell you that once you master this, it starts getting really fun, because you start thinking more about what's happening in front of you than you do about the settings that you're using in your camera. Okay, I hope that's been useful for you. I know this is a bit of a long one, but it's such a worthwhile thing to master, so I didn't want to skip over anything that I think could be helpful for you. And please remember that only through testing and experimenting and failure will you master this. No one picks up a camera and immediately goes into manual and can just shoot everything straight away. This takes practice to embed not only the skill set but also the knowledge and the experience. Only through making mistakes will you really learn this stuff, and it's so worth doing. So please don't beat yourself up if you can't get it right straight away. Go away, do the exercise. If it's not working out for you, come back and re-watch these videos to really get the knowledge down, and then go out and try again. Don't be discouraged. This is the biggest hurdle to overcome in photography, and once you've nailed it, you'll be flying. So keep going. Okay, so I hope I see you in the next video. If you've made it this far, please drop me a like by clicking the little thumbs up down below, and subscribe. And if you want to get notified when I post new videos, then click the little bell, and I hope to see you in the next one.